Wesley's historic questions were about what to teach, how to teach, and what to do. For this interval of features for the Connectional Table's emerging forum, we will seek to update these questions for our current moment. We will invite energetic conversation that will illumine our identity, which is tied to what and how we teach, our preferred actions, what we do, and our abiding hopes as we envision the future United Methodist Church. Our intent is to generate passion and energy for conversations that help us walk forward together. Today, I am joined by Bishop Cynthia Fierro Harvey, President of the Council of Bishops and the Bishop of the Louisiana Episcopal Area. Good morning, Bishop Fierro Harvey.
Good morning. Good morning. It's good to be with you.
We're going to begin kind of just with a conversation about who we are as a denomination. We sometimes struggle to define our identity. So what would you describe as the preoccupations and passions that people would see as the mark of a contemporary United Methodist?
What I would like people to see about our identity, or about our experience, what people would experience about who we are, because I don't think we're fully there. Obviously, the things for me that mark being a United Methodist, and I haven't been a United Methodist all my life, so I can think about the things that brought me to the United Methodist Church. An open table, grace upon grace. And the openness, I grew up Roman Catholic. And so the open table, the openness, the allowing me to be me, to be a female leader in the church, obviously was an important thing that brought me to the church. So I see those as foundational about who we are. Now we say that, and I'm not sure we always mean it. But I do hope that even in the tension and even in those struggles, when we say it, that we can people can experience it more so than not, and that we can live out of that identity of openness, of an open table. And I'm not just talking about a communion table, while that's important, but an openness to be at the table.
Well, say more about that. Of course, the image that came immediately to mind for me was the communion table. But what does it mean in a denomination that, at least in the U.S., already struggles with diversity, perhaps in some way, that you might not have a diversity of people coming to the communion table in a local church? What does that mean? What does that look like?
I think about, and I wrote about this, about my childhood Thanksgiving table, that to me was like a communion table. It was sacramental in many ways. And it wasn't just about the food. It was about hospitality, the openness to gather at table. And yes, when we talk about open table, the first image we have is the communion table, and rightfully so. But at our table, we had all kinds of folk gathered, people who sometimes I didn't know who they were. Recently, my brother shared a photograph, and it's like, who is that in that family photo? And we know it's not a family member, but we knew that when we took the family photo, everybody would be in the photo if you were there. So there were strangers at this table. There were people who didn't like each other at this table. There were people who loved each other at this table. And so to me, that broadens my perspective of what an open table looks like. And when we talk about the global nature of this church that we're in and the diversity that we have, for me to even be at some of these tables, I often look around and thinking, gosh, how did I get here? The privilege of being at these tables. And I also understand that not everybody has that same privilege, right? And so I don't take that lightly. I take that with a lot of responsibility, being female, being Hispanic, Latina, all of those things. I don't take those things lightly, that I am at the table with some responsibility. So I just think that for us, and let me just tell you one quick little anecdotal story. In a church that I served, I'll never forget this, and I'm not going to name names, but I do know the names and I can see the faces. Serving communion and serving one of the most conservative women I knew in the church, brushing up shoulder to shoulder with a dear friend who was gay and suffered from HIV/AIDS. And they were shoulder to shoulder at the communion table. And that image, I can never unsee that. And I'm so glad. I will never be able to unsee what that looked like at the table. And you know, when you're serving communion, often at the communion rail, you're going down, and I got to these two, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is an image of what I would like our church to be like. And that was years and years and years ago. So when I think about identity, when we talk about identity, that image just keeps coming to my mind of being at the table, serving these two people shoulder to shoulder at the same table, same communion bread, same cup. And here they are, shoulder to shoulder. To me, that's an identity perhaps that I long for in the United Methodist Church.
So what speaks to you in terms of the historic identity of United Methodists and United Methodism that gets us to that place? What is it in our core beliefs or our core theology that would get us to that place of this gay person suffering with HIV and this very conservative Christian at the same altar, at the same table, drinking from the same communion cup pre-COVID?
You know, one of the places I go back to is the theological task in the United Methodist Book of Discipline. We are a vital web of interactive relationships. That phrase, a vital web of interactive relationships. There is that, you know, we call it connection sometimes. But to me, that statement of a vital web, that means that I can't live in this web without you. It is, you know, it is vital that we're in this web together. And sometimes it looks more like a hairball than it does a web, right? But it is a vital web of interactive relationships. I cannot live without you. And I think for me, that's the image at the table. I think that's sort of baked into my DNA, frankly. But you know, I just that phrase of a vital web of interactive relationships. And every once in a while, I just go back and read that theological task, and I just go back and really read through that and reflect on some of those words. We are a vital web of interactive relationships, and that's what helps us be at that table together.
We're all different, but we're not complete until we're together.
Yeah.
What a beautiful image. So let's go forward then. So in the U.S., we've just gone through a very polarizing election. Ideologically, there's lots of polarization, especially in the United States. How do we get to a place of connectionalism? Certainly not, I'm not talking about sameness, but how do we deal with our diversity within the context of our connection and welcome that diversity?
Right. You know, I've always said, and certainly over the last couple of years, I've talked a lot about the big tent church, of can we live in the tension? Can we live out of that center, and can we broaden our center? My hope every day is that center can be broadened more and more, because I really do think that that's where most of us live. But I also recognize that there are people that can't live there. And is there some way that we can continue to honor and bless those who can't? I don't know how to say that any better at the moment, but I want to articulate it in a way that rather than tearing one another apart, can we just say, look, I know you can't live in my center, right? Your center's different than mine, and that's okay. It doesn't make you a bad person. In the words of my friend Bishop Palmer, there are no bad people. It's just you have a different perspective on this. I have dearest friends who stand on the total opposite place politically than I do. I don't love them any less. I hope they don't love me any less. And I think that there's just something that right now we're living in this culture where all we have to say is like bad stuff about each other, rather than saying, look, I don't agree with you. I don't know that I ever will, but I love you. And let's find a way that we can express that love for one another. And that might be together and that might be separated, but that's still okay. And it's sort of blessing and sending. I was on the mediation team. We talked a lot about, how do you bless and send? I'd love the perfect world would be that, we could all live in this church together and honor one another's differences. I'm slowly beginning to realize that not everybody can do that. And so if we can't, then how do we bless one another and in the process and stop tearing one another apart? That is a pet peeve of mine. I just can't stand being in that rhetoric and in the sort of beating each other up from opposite sides of the room. Doesn't help anybody. So can we come together at some point and, that whole agree to disagree, maybe there is something to that.
Yeah. You talk about living in the tension.
Mm.
And certainly with the delays in General Conference that have already happened, we are in that tension. So as you think about, living in the tension, what are the things that ground you when you are trying to live in the tension of everything is not resolved, everything is not figured out, we might not even know how to figure it out? How do you live in that tension of the in-between?
Yeah, the already, not yet, all of that kind of stuff that we learned in seminary, right? It's a hard place. It is, because you feel like you're being torn to shreds sometimes in the process. It's funny that in this time, I've gone back and pulled things off my bookshelf that I read a long time ago. And I was cleaning up some books and it's like, here's Brueggemann's Prophetic Imagination. Let me pull that out and read it again. I went back to read Gil Rendell's Back to Zero. There's a lot of that I've just pulled out again. How do I live faithfully? How do I live with integrity in this time of tension? And how do I not get sucked into it? I think that's also going back to your previous question about the polarization. It's so easy to get sucked into it. And so how do I keep myself outside of that? Richard Rohr talks about leading from the edge of the inside. I just want to be out there leading from the edge and looking in versus trying to be in the center looking out. And I just think sometimes our best teaching comes from the margins. Maybe having grown up in the margins, maybe again, my own personal experience helps me in understanding that. But I think when we're living in the tension, if you get too much in the center, all you see is your center. Whereas if you are leading from the edge of the edge of the outside here, it's can I look into it versus out from it. So I go back again. I said to some of the things that really have been foundational for me. I've gone back to a lot of Friedman and family systems, and because we're broken. I mean, there's just no other way to say it, but it's not only United Methodists that are broken. The world is kind of broken. And so, maybe it's part of being a prophet that we're called to here is, do we have enough imagination, prophetic imagination, is again borrowing from Brueggemann, to lead our people in a new way. One of the things, I forgot who said it, that creativity is birthed in the tension. So could we, in this time where who knows what's on either end of this, Susan Beaumont talks about it being liminal, being at a threshold. Nothing in our rearview mirror, it's like I look in my rearview mirror and it's like nothing in front of me looks very familiar, right? It looks like nothing in my rearview mirror. So how do I get creative? How do I sort of build in this time versus I could just pull the covers over my head. And in some kind of weird way, I find this time kind of exciting. Because I think that we're at a place where we might have an opportunity that we've never had before to be creative, to be imaginative. And so it's like, okay, that's kind of exciting to me to look into the future. One of my strength finders, my number one strength is futurist. So I think that I always have my eye in the future. So what is it that I can do in this time to help lead us there versus getting stuck here and not doing anything? I mean, because that's the danger here. You can pull the covers over your head and do nothing. And frankly, I will just say that there are days where pulling the covers over your head might be the best thing you can do. It's okay, but I do think that we have an opportunity here to use this time very differently, to sort of be imaginative, to be creative, and hopefully be a little prophetic.
In the midst of COVID and the pandemic of racism and the natural disasters that are going on around us, taking care of ourselves sometimes means putting your head a little bit under the covers. But when you come out, have you thought about what does the church need to do differently to be vital, effective, relevant in the world that is taking shape around us right now?
I would say for me is listen. Listen to what the world is telling us, and use this time. I think that I will just say that during this COVID time, especially, life's gotten a little simpler, right? In the beginning of COVID, people went back to riding bicycles. We went on our morning walks here. Life got simpler. Got to meet my neighbors, see who they were, people I had never met. Met the dogs in the neighborhood, that sort of thing. And I think maybe it's been kind of good for us. So in this time, did you try to buy yeast? Early on, you couldn't buy yeast. You couldn't buy a bike. So I think maybe making life much more simple, and understanding that if we listen to one another and listen to the stuff around us, I live in Southwest Louisiana. Southwest Louisiana got battered by 2 hurricanes, one after another. Then we had a third. You had a pandemic, racial unrest, and then 3 hurricanes. It all gets kind of crazy really fast. But what I learned is as I listened to these people, particularly in the Lake Charles area, they were resilient. They were faithful. They brought me to tears more than once. And so I think about, could we use this time as a Sabbath? Could we listen carefully? Like even listen to nature? It's like I've noticed things I never noticed before. It's like I'm sure that magnolia tree blooms every year. but I just noticed it this year. So if we're going to be vital again, how do we listen? How do we learn from one another right now? How do we leverage what we're learning in this experience to move forward in a different way? And all the rules kind of, it's like, worship, no worship, online, in person, mask, no mask, all of those things. I just think if we just get down to the basics of blocking and tackling, as they say, of what it means to be faithful followers of Jesus. Can I listen deeply to the people around me, to nature? So if there's one thing I would say is listen, and I'll say that I have to work on this myself. It's not something that comes, easily to many of us, right? Is to listen deeply. But if we're going to be vital again, we really got to listen to one another. And maybe in this time that we've had for the last 9 months, what have we learned? What have we learned about just sort of the basics of how we relate and come together?
Who would you listen to who you think has not been heard in our denomination? Because you talked a little bit about margins, leading from the center of the margins, hearing the voices on the margins. Who do you think you would listen to in particular? And I know it would be everyone in reality, but are there voices that have not been heard that need particular attention in terms of listening?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I really do think, I think often, as I follow my friends down in, for example, in South Texas, the COVID is just rampant in some of those areas. El Paso's, off the charts. We haven't, the Native American community is suffering greatly. We haven't really heard, and I'll take some responsibility for that. I think that there are people we have just not tuned our ear to. We might have heard them, but I'm not sure we have listened and really tune our ear. And it's always the people on the margins. And one of the things I've learned living in South Louisiana in a disaster zone is that in a disaster, and I would call this time being sort of in a disaster, is that the marginalized just get more marginalized, right? So people of color, it's like their life is on the edge. And some of these folks were living on the edge long before a pandemic, and now here we are. I'm so thankful for doctors and nurses and physical therapists and all of those people who have been incredibly taxed and essential. But I also think about the person in the food service or the laundry. And, I think we need to listen for that. And I think we've gotten a little bit of a glimpse of that but it's on television, it's on social media. And I don't know what that feels like. I don't know. When I don't have to worry about whether my child got fed lunch. But I know that there are people who do.
You're the president of the Council of Bishops, but you're also a leader in Episcopal area.
Yeah.
And what do you think about the ministry of annual conferences right now? We talk a lot about the general church and ministry on the general church level. What is essential about the role of annual conferences?
Yeah, I live with a foot two worlds in many ways. And one certainly does affect the other. That's back to the vital web of interactive relationships, right? But the annual conference is where the rubber hits the road. Actually, the local church is where the rubber hits the road. We talk about the separation of the church, and we talk about, budgets and all of that. It's like, okay, the only reason we have a denominational budget is because somebody sat in a pew or a virtual worship service and wrote a check, and somebody maybe even from their Social Security check wrote a check for $10 and sent it to their local church. That is the only reason that we exist, right? That's what turns the lights on. So I think that's sort of that connection back. And I think sometimes we forget that. I think sometimes we forget that the general church stuff is only possible because somebody somewhere sat in a pew or in front of a computer or whatever. And now the fact that people aren't showing up to sit in a pew, these churches are struggling. And I will just say, for me, I've got a great concern for the local church, and I have deeper concerns for our clergy. Our clergy went from, online or from in-person worship to being televangelists in about a 3-day period of time. And every day has been different. And just when they think they've got it figured out, something else changes, right? I worry for their spiritual, mental, physical health because they're constantly having to pivot. And then they're up against, the person that says, it's my God-given right not to wear a mask, or it's my God-given right to show up for worship. And so they're dealing with that every single day. And for every letter I get in my inbox, that's somebody sitting in somebody's pew, right? And so these clergy are, I think, they're just being pushed and pulled and pushed and pulled. And I worry greatly for them. And so when we talk about impact of these folks in the local churches, the vitality of a local church, the pressures of a pastor these days, nothing you and I ever went to seminary for prepares us for this is just a whole different ball game today than for me it was 10 years ago in the church or 15 years ago. Certainly as a bishop, what I did 8 years ago and what I'm doing today in my area are completely different. So I think that we, it's like we've got to cut each other a little bit of slack here, extend that grace, because I think our pastors are under a lot of pressure. And some of it is denominational pressure, some of it is local pressure, and they live on eggshells, they walk on eggshells. If I say this, I'm going to offend this person. If I don't say it, I'm going to offend that person. And they're going to take their marbles and go home. And it is a hard time to be a pastor of a local church. And I don't think we cannot forget that. Is pastoring a church today is so very different than I know that it was for me, and it was for people even 10 years ago, 5 years ago, last year. Yeah.
There's not as much respect for the profession. The denomination is struggling in terms of vitality. I mean, that's been the expectations on pastors are high, and pastors are trying to navigate a pandemic and keep themselves and their families healthy, in addition to making decisions about whether to have worship, all of these things.
And I think that, laity are in the same boat. A lot of them have lost their jobs, or family members have lost their jobs. They're having to, teach their children at home too. They're struggling as well. So it's not, nobody's better off than the other. This is kind of been an equal opportunity time for all, disasters for all of us. But I just think that laity are also struggling, and I think what happens too is when we're stressed, we say and do things that we wouldn't if we weren't. And that's where I think where we, back to your polarization question much earlier, that I think the system is stressed. And so when the system is stressed, it makes us do and say things that we would never do and say.
Well, you mentioned stress, and certainly here in the United States, there's societal stress. And over the last several months, we've had the very high profile killings of African American people, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. Can you say something about that in terms of how does the church begin to address racism? Where are we with that? Where are we going?
First of all, I think we've got to repent for our sins of the past. The church is not immune to our racism that's been baked into who we are. So I just have to be upfront and say that right up front. And I think that for some people, you can take giant steps, and for some of us, it can just be baby steps. And both equally important depending on the context. Again, I live in the South and I live in Louisiana, where racism is, alive and well. And we've done these wonderful, we did these modules. We did about 4 modules of, anti-racism, white fragility, and it was. We had several hundred, or about 100 or so people. It wasn't a mandatory thing, participate. And I thought, for the first time, some of us used the words white fragility and white privilege and race, and called it for what it was. So we took baby steps. Are we there? No. Will we get there? I pray. But I think that the church, if not the church, then, who else? I can't leave it to somebody else. And so I think we're starting to address this in ways with the Dismantling Racism campaign. When you dismantle something, you've got to do it one piece at a time. If you tear down the whole thing, it could be tragic. So I think dismantling this one piece at a time might just be what we can commit to doing right now. But we've got to commit to moving forward and being a voice. As United Methodists, like I said, we have a sordid past when it comes to racist issues. But I think it's time for us to really move forward and take a step that perhaps others aren't courageous enough to take. And we've got to be courageous. That's what it's going to take. So for us to be able to say Black lives do matter, that's courageous for some people that have never used those words before. And so I'm going to celebrate every small victory. And those large victories we will celebrate as well. But for some people, it's got to be baby steps. For some people, it's giant leaps. And we've got to all start moving some direction, or we're going to be here again. And what I don't want to do is wait till the next George Floyd for all of us to rally up again. Our memories are short. We almost have racial amnesia sometimes. And so I want to make sure that this stays in front of people, and that we continue to speak truth into this and claim it as our responsibility as United Methodists, but also as just faithful followers of Jesus. This is what we have as our priority right now.
Yeah. So you talk about, in the course of this conversation, you've talked about vision. You've talked about learning how to listen in a way that where our ears are attuned to people on the margin. You've talked about dismantling racism. You've talked about what brings relevancy to the local church. All of this that is before us. What kind of leadership do you imagine emerging in the future to address these kinds of challenges?
Prophetic, courageous, resilient. I think those, if I had to kind of pick some watchwords, those would be words that I would use, because I think that status quo is just not going to do it. And innovation, creativity, but resilience to me is, can we live out of this period of time as a nation, as the world, in a way that we say, we are resilient people because we are followers of Jesus. And so for me, those are three words that I would use: prophetic, resilient, courageous, being imaginative. I think I see that's required of me right now. Sometimes doing the unpopular, and the things that maybe not everybody is going to like, but important for me to say, this is the place where I'm going to take the stand, and I'm willing to take the heat for it. One of the things we recently learned from Susan Beaumont in our Council of Bishops meeting is that change often comes with heat, or heat causes change. You can't, potatoes without boiling are yucky. And so sometimes the little heat is what we need to cause some change. Now, some of us are saying, wait a minute, I'm boiling down here. I get that. There's more heat than most of us really want to have on most days right now. But out of this heat, can we be courageous enough, resilient enough to withstand some of this heat, to create something new? That's what being maybe prophetic means right now.
You can't be prophetic without courage.
Right.
And I think that the piece around resilience, there has to also be some trust in the resilience of the church, and some trust in the resilience of our people, that change can come, and the church is not going to break.
Right, right.
When you, we talk about spiritual leadership, and obviously the episcopacy is, as bishop, you are a general superintendent for the church. What kind of leadership within the episcopacy do you imagine emerging, or what style of leadership, or which direction in terms of leadership? And then what is gained or lost by the proposal to declare a moratorium on electing new bishops?
Right. Well, back to courageous, resilient, prophetic. I think that's what's needed. And then what's gained. And I prefer not to use the word moratorium here, but perhaps limited elections, or no new, the Council of Bishops has really been, it was agreed upon that we supported for the grassroots efforts by some to not elect bishops this in 21. I think if I were to say, for me, what the gain is, and there's some losses. There's some losses, clearly. Losses of no new leadership, those sorts of things. But we've got to deal with some realities right now. And if we are to wait, the dust will settle, right? It allows us to catch up with ourselves, mostly. And I think that we can make a better decision in 3 years than we could make in 21 at a jurisdictional conference. We would know if the church is separating. We would know who's staying, who's going. We would have some clearer understanding of who we are. Back to your original question about identity, right? We would have a clear understanding of who we are and the kind of leaders that we needed. And so I think we're just better positioned to make a better decision in 24 or 25 if we end up changing the quadrennial cycle, but in 24, let's say. And that's a 3-year time that we can truly look at where we are, who we are, and what we need as far as leaders are concerned for our future. I think that is a big gain. That is a huge gain. So to me, yes, it's a financial decision, right? That's a reality. It's a financial reality. But the more strategic reason for me is understanding, again, who we are, where we are, and what we need. Things settle. And it's going to take probably more than 3 years, but we'll know a little bit more in 24 than we do now. And so I think it would allow us to make good decisions about Episcopal leadership. It will help us make good decisions about where we need what kind of leadership. And I think we would be hasty in many ways to go ahead and make an election of a bishop now rather than the future. Now, I recognize not everybody will agree with that, but for me, I just, deep in my soul and my gut, is that I really believe we will have the capacity to make a better decision in 24 than we would in 21. We would know more than we do now.
Thank you so much for joining us. I very much appreciate your time.
Thank you for yours. Appreciate you a lot. Thanks.